recruit some help or find some gardening space for those who are looking. So at this point, our recording feature is turned on. If you are very confident you don't want to be seen, you can always turn off your camera feature. Though, as I shared with some folks at the beginning, in the past when I've done recordings, only I have shown on YouTube. So everything from this point on until we break out for community connections will be on YouTube later if you want to share this with friends. So let's dig in to talking about the basics of community gardening, a couple examples, and some different models and ways you can set this up. And the first model, the one that many of us are likely most familiar with, is plot rental, in which a community organization gets together to build garden beds and families or individuals rent them out for a space. Everything that they grow is their own. That's one of our more common methods, but it's not the only one. Another model that I've seen and have personal experience with is called the food is free movement, in which one person or group of people, one organization, maintains beds that have no fence around them, have no rules around harvesting, and are just grown for the use of the community to walk by and take as much food as they want at any time they want. We've also seen some successful efforts that grow from donation, in which one group serves as the farmers and harvesters, but they're not the eaters of the food that they grow. All of that food may go to a hunger relief effort or into directly into the hands of folks.
No, I think the other way.
I want to save these, white, so I can put sanitizer.
I'm just going to mention right now that we are getting quite a lot of feedback from microphones. So if you're not speaking and would like to mute your microphone, you can do that at the bottom left corner of your screen.
Before that, they were doing it like every 2 years.
They never washed their hands.
No, now they're doing it.
If you're in the audience and would like to mute your microphone, please see that at the bottom right corner of your bottom left corner of your screen. Right now, I'm going to, okay, that fixed the silence. Now we're a lot quieter. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to fill in when you are able and tell us a little bit about the models that your particular community gardens you're a part of now or have been a part of are organized, and any tips you may have on that. And as you like, popcorn style.
Well, okay, I'll jump in. I'm Patty Sechi, and I'm representing Greenwich Community Gardens in Connecticut, but here I am in Virginia, and I'm really, still involved in some of the things that are going on here, like with Project Grows and Allegheny Mountain Institute. So when I first started the community gardens, and now it's probably almost 11 years ago, I started with the, I should say we, because it was my, maybe my seed of an idea, but you never do this stuff by yourself. You need the community, you need everyone. So we started with free plots. Because the first garden we started was at a low-income housing complex. And my concern was that I didn't want anyone to be marginalized. I wanted, everyone in the community to have equal access to, the ability to grow healthy food and come together as a community around food. As time went on, some of the folks actually at the low-income housing complex who were on my planning team and steering committees and all that sort of thing, came to me and said, you really need to charge us a little bit, or give us a sliding scale.
Thank you.
Because we all need to buy in and be responsible. And, you know, frankly, the cost of a plot is probably similar to what it would cost to go to McDonald's for dinner with the family. So we started to charge for plots, and that actually was really good. And I think it really spoke to people's integrity that they wanted that buy-in. They didn't want to just have things given to them. And so it kind of grew from there. But frankly, anyone who is struggling or cannot afford a plot is always welcome to have a plot. Most people do find a way to pay for some of it because it's pretty inexpensive compared to the cost of, you know, buying all that food for your family throughout the seasons. So that's what we did. And the only other thing I want to mention there is that we also always made sure that we did have food to give away. So we've always had churches or small groups that were growing for the food pantry. And to make it completely inclusive, we included universal access beds for people with mobility issues. We were trying to really find a way to keep everybody engaged and everyone invited.
Thank you. Jenelle, I know you mentioned earlier some partnership with the food bank.
Yes. So we do a couple of different things. We have some beds that are tended by members of the community under the direction of one of our local youth groups. And that the production from that goes to one of our area food pantries. We also have beds that are tended for the benefit of the community. And rather than just have people go in and harvest whatever they want, we have 2 tables set alongside of the road that are our free community tables. So when there's a harvest coming out of that's available, we put it on the table and then get word out that there is free food on the table. We've also invited groups like Allegheny Mountain Institute, any of the local farmers, home growers, anyone that has an abundance of produce to bring it and put it on the tables, and we'll get word out to the community for that. In addition, we have raised beds that are available for a $10 lease annually. We're organic, so we have the soil, the amended soil, all of that available. The $10 covers our water cost because water is very expensive in Waynesboro. But we also, for our low income brothers and sisters, which is one of the main thrusts of our community garden, we waive that and also provide their plants for them. So there's an opportunity for anyone at any level to get involved in any way, whether it's for themselves, to garden on behalf of a neighbor, to garden to put into the food pantries, just to come garden and grow together as a community.
Thanks. Any other words on this, on different ways to organize?
One example of a Grow for Donation garden in our community that Project Grows is connected with is the Bridgewater Food Pantry Garden. So that garden is run by Dr. Tim Krebs. He is a professor at Bridgewater College, and they have a group of students that work with him as well. And everything from that garden goes directly to the food pantry. So we've worked with their students out at Project Grows, but they're a community garden that also accepts volunteers. So that's one example of that model. And then I also wanted to mention the connection to what I was mentioning before with school gardens, which is that oftentimes in the summer, school gardens are looking for volunteers to help maintain the garden when the school is not in session. So for instance, the garden at Dixon, we at Project Grows are often looking for volunteers during the summer months, and then the model is similar to food is free. Folks that volunteer with us are able to take food home from that garden. So there are some limitations when it comes to school gardens during the school year, but in the summertime, there's some more flexibility and definitely a big need for volunteers.
Thanks.
I was just going to say all the gardens that I've been involved with the exception of the Newtown Community Garden, have been free gardens. And I think I can't remember the exact cost of the Newtown Community Garden, but it was low. It was pretty low. What I have encountered is with all the gardens that I've been involved with is surprisingly some difficulty in the produce actually getting used. It's sometimes they end up harvesting the stuff for people and basically going door to door, begging them to take it, sort of thing.
I've experienced that too. Sometimes the planting is the most exciting part, and we have visions of ourselves with gardens like maybe our grandparents had, and sometimes we forget that often our grandparents had a more flexible working life and maybe a lot of free labor in the sense of having a passel of children that could go and pick the green beans. And for many of us in a more modern life, things get busy and we find that there's just not the consistent time to get back into the garden like we expected. And then sometimes it falls on the part of the organizer to say, okay, should I go pick the peppers before they rot on the vine? Because I don't want to rob people of that experience, but I also don't want the food to go bad. So that leads us kind of into our next section. I'd like to talk about some specific needs for success in community gardening. And the very first one on my list was community buy-in. We've already had a question from the audience specifically about low-income housing units and properties. The reality of gaining buy-in not only from the residents, but also from the owners of the property. So I'd like to hear from you all a little bit more about community buy-in broadly, and also something about community buy-in in particularly vulnerable neighborhoods.
Well, I think I could speak to that. When I got the idea for starting the community gardens in Greenwich, Connecticut, which, when most people hear Greenwich, Connecticut, they're like, Greenwich, Connecticut. But there are a lot of folks in Greenwich, Connecticut who are living under the poverty line, and they're kind of invisible. They're tucked away in low-income housing. A lot of people didn't even know was there, and they've lived there all their lives. So I found that one of the housing communities had a large space that had been a community garden for that community many years before, and it had just kind of gone fallow. So the first thing I did was I met with the housing authority, and it's not land they could build on, and it was just a mess. So they were happy to have us do something with it and provide this opportunity for the residents, and they didn't have to really do anything. The one thing, although I shouldn't say that, they did provide water, which is a huge thing, and they provided the land. So, but they didn't have to make, the efforts of building the garden. The next thing we did was we met with the residents, and I want to say about that too is anytime you have a meeting of any kind, offer food and drink and anything that you think will make people feel comfortable and want to be there. So we met with the residents, and happily many of them were very enthusiastic about it, and several of them had been part of that pre-existing garden. So I would say that's the first thing is find out who you're serving, and do they want to be served? Do they want to be part of this? Because you're building community, and you need that community to be interested in what you're doing. So those were the first things, and that was a really lucky break because I started with a budget of $0. So I didn't have to go through leasing the land, all kinds of other things that can happen if you're building a garden with maybe the town government, which the second garden was. I think I had one other thing to say about that. Oh, the other thing is know that that population has very little, money to spend on extra stuff. So, it was clear to me that the best way to get everybody involved and keep them involved was to provide everything they needed. So the beds, the soil, tools, wheelbarrows, plants, and, I just reached out to the community and got a lot of good responses and was able to get a lot of that stuff, like I said, without an initial budget.
Thank you. Other thoughts on that?
Hi. I want the outside of the Newtown Community Garden, which was on private land. All the gardens that I've been involved with have been not that. The current garden, Sears Hill Community Garden, is actually, I didn't say this earlier, it's actually located in a town park of Staunton called, I call it Sears Hill Park. It's officially called Woodrow Park. It's the top portion of that park that has the pedestrian bridge and the flower beds and all that stuff down lower. I think a lot of people don't know that it's the same park or that even that the garden is in a park. The only sign is that there's a dog poop stand for bags and a trash can, and that's the only sign that it's a park. The other two gardens that I was mainly involved with, the Stafford Garden and the Forest Community Garden, were on lands that were owned by Housing Authority and Habitat for Humanity. On the Stafford Garden, there was two adjoined parcels that were one of them was owned by Housing Authority and one of them was owned by Habitat. And the Boris Garden was kind of bequested to, I believe, it was Habitat. At the time of those gardens, Habitat was funding us actively through the season. The last involvement I had with Habitat was the reno of the Sears Hill Garden, with the understanding that they were getting out of the community garden business. Funding the ongoing efforts at the Sears Hill Garden has basically been me out of my pocket, and the other co-manager of the garden lives in the house just down the hill and out of her pocket. I think we need to look into what to do about that, because neither of us has a lot of money to be spending on this. I've been thinking about approaching Lowe's to perhaps donate things to us, so that we're not spending our own money on it. I haven't done that yet.
Other thoughts?
I wouldn't, if you're looking for a place, be creative. Ask. We were fortunate in the fact that we had been given a church property to use to kind of flip, but the community garden, it has enabled us to use our ground, the soil, in a much more effective way that yields a greater benefit for the community than grass. There may be churches out there, particularly churches with smaller memberships or churches that are going into a state of decline, that may be happy for a group to ask to use their land, as it will cut their property maintenance costs. Don't be afraid to ask. I know one of the things that we're dealing with now is, Patty, you had mentioned providing all of the tools and such for everyone. We are not doing that right now because of COVID-19. We're requiring everyone to bring their stuff. But if we have gardeners who don't have access to tools, we will provide those for them. As it's a community effort, we have growers who are bringing in plants for people. We have others who will sponsor the purchase of hand tools for people. All of that stuff can be made available. It's just getting the community together and being creative about doing that, looking for lots that would be fruitful and doing a little research and finding out and not being afraid to ask.
Thank you.
When it comes to community buy-in,
I like those ideas. I just wanted to say.
I would also add, if you're thinking of starting a community garden, a great place to start is to find out what's already being done in your community and to connect with the folks that maybe are already involved in community gardens. So if you're in our community here in Augusta County, this is a great place to start. But if you're in another community, it's important to find that out so that you're sure that you're not duplicating efforts. As Ed mentioned about sometimes there being more produce and you don't know, where it's going to go, or we know that one of the big threats is underutilization. So if there are already efforts being done in your community, it's great to connect with those and see first if you can get involved with that before starting the process of starting a new garden. So at Project Rose, we've gotten a lot of inquiries from folks that are excited and passionate about this work. And so there are people, in the community that want to be involved. So just making those connections is a really great place to start.
Thank you. I want to mention as we go on that if you're in the audience and have a question, you can always use the chat feature to leave your question for us. If we don't get to you right away, we're coming back. So feel free to submit your questions at any time. Some of our panelists have already talked a little bit about land and the rights to it. And we have one question about what if you're not entering an agreement with city or town government for your land? What about privately owned land? And have we heard of any really successful examples of people helping to install gardens on folks' own property? I've heard a lot of attempts to start something like this, but I don't know of any in our neighborhood that have gotten off the ground and been successful yet.
Can I just say something? I'm sorry. My name's Allison, and I asked a question in the chat. I was just wondering if anyone had ever had success with city property, but specifically not a community garden. So getting the city to agree to let individuals have their own plots where they live. So right now, the city of Staunton's housing authority feels that community gardens aren't safe because of the pandemic. So I'm wondering if anyone had success with going to, let's say, low-income housing and each resident gets their own bed, if anything like that had ever been modeled anywhere. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison.
We had a little bit of that going on. Sorry.
Go ahead.
We had a little bit of that in the Stafford Garden and the Burris Garden, where people had their own spots. It still wasn't the buy-in, but there were dedicated boxes to individuals. And that was also true at of course, with the buy-in at the Newtown Garden. There were individual spots, although there were some, in all those gardens, they were communal areas. Currently in the Sears Hill Garden, it's 100% communal. There are no dedicated boxes.
We'll talk more about this when we break out into the community, and if any of our audience members have any ideas about a way to maybe advance that project a step further, let's return to it. Any other thoughts from our panel on land, rights to land, if there are challenges to look out for? I know we've mentioned a few things already.
Yeah, I would have to say when you're searching for a site, there are a few things that you want to take into consideration outside of land rights, but just is there enough sun? You need at least 6 hours of sun, 6 to 8 hours of sun every day. Is there water? What's the soil like? So I'd recommend that you do a soil test, and a pretty advanced soil test, just to make sure you know what's there before you start your garden, because it's really hard to go back afterwards. So they're just some of those kind of basic things that you normally would think about even in a home garden. And as far as land rights go, the second garden that we created was on town property, but one of our partners was the town, the Conservation Commission, and the, what was the other, there was another commission that got really involved, and they were really big supporters. So they actually took us around to about 8 different sites in town, or 8 to 10, that were possible areas where we could start our second community garden. And we went with a list of things like this, soil, water, access is another big thing, because there are parts of your area that might be food deserts, and or there might be neighborhoods that are very walkable to a community garden. So you just think about all these different things that will make your garden successful. And we found a site with the town, and then it was quite a process going through a lot of different organizations or departments in the town to get, to finally get the okay and to get a lease.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about structuring our efforts and leadership, figuring out who's behind the scenes, how we resolve disagreements. If things aren't harvested, whose job is that? So I know there are many different ways to handle this, and I'd like for you all to offer some that you've seen and possibly some tips to make it go more smoothly. Jump in anytime. Okay, I'll go first. So with my experience with this particular issue, the community gardens that I was involved with were maintained by a nonprofit organization that I was an employee of. And we tried very much to organize the community gardens and then step back and let the folks who had taken responsibility for their individual plots have full control. It didn't always work. Sometimes we had to step in and take out plants that had died or food that had fallen where it grew and begun to rot and reseed the soil. And fortunately, we were lucky enough to have a core group of Boys and Girls Club students that came every Wednesday morning to have a lesson with me in the garden. And they always had some required weeding before we started the lesson. It was not their most popular teacher. But they were kind of my captive labor force. I think that some things could have been straightened out in that situation had we had a more complete agreement with people who had chosen to garden there about what to do if they couldn't get back to the garden, or what to do if they had questions. So I'm wondering if there are other experiences with garden coordinators, with sometimes council leadership among the gardeners that could have been better than our experience.
We're a small new garden. We're not like Project Grows or like Ed's Gardens. We're new. And we're learning this together, but what we do have we have a youth group that's responsible for one of the gardens. So they have people from their church, and we reach out to other groups and organizations to help them with the food pantry garden. We are individuals who have their own garden plots. They are expected to tend their garden. We also ask that they tithe back a portion of their time into the large in-bed garden, just as a way of giving back to the community and being involved in the community. We see a community garden not as just a way to produce food for one's family, but to connect families and individuals. So we want to make sure that people are working together while protecting, without overstepping. Like, we don't allow one family to work in another family's bed. But so there's that. We invite the community to come help. We have some people who just want to garden, but they don't really want the responsibility of maintaining a garden through the season. So we invite them to come in. We do have coordinators for our in-ground bed, our raised beds, that kind of stuff. So, and then Allison, I noticed you asked a question about people of color, people of various gender identities. We try to make sure in inviting everyone to the garden that everyone is welcome at the garden, that gardens are beautiful for their variety, and we stress that our gardens aren't only a place of beautiful variety of plants, but beautiful variety of people and community, and we want to grow together. So we try to stress that not only is your responsibility as part of this garden community to help maintain your plants and those of the garden as a whole, but also to help build relationships with each other and support each other and help each other grow. So it's a positive experience for everyone, and we're working together to build that community.
Thanks for that and for that question. Are there more thoughts either on structure and leadership or on creating the garden as a place of inclusion and of justice?
Yeah, I think community gardens they offer a unique opportunity to create a very diverse, inclusive, safe place for everyone to flourish, regardless of age, race, economic standing, political views. When you walk in the garden door, or garden gate, I should say, I like to say that, like, everyone's equal. When we walk in there, we are all gardeners together. And I think the operative word in community garden is community. I agree with Jenelle that, we're coming together around food, but we're really creating community. And it's so awesome to have a place where it can be very diverse. And I know that, the panel right now is not looking super diverse, but we all work with diverse populations. And it takes all of us to make a really healthy community in a garden. And it is so awesome to have people who have come from so many different places in the world, bringing with them their culture, their food culture, and their stories from their childhood, and seeds that come from wherever they grew up, and sharing that food together in one place. I mean, we're all better for it, and it's a wonderful thing. But with all that said, I guess because our gardens are so large, we did find out after a time that it was helpful to have guidelines and rules around, what we all can agree on is acceptable within the garden, to keep it that safe space for everyone. So we started with a planning team, which was not members of the garden necessarily, although a lot of them became members of the garden, but the original team was a representation of the larger community. But then so once that was in place, a steering committee was formed, and that was all gardeners. So the gardeners themselves, along with myself or whoever was leading the team, really kind of created the culture and the rules. And those are revisited every year because sometimes some of the things don't work, and that's totally fine. That's how we all learn together. But it has helped, and now we have, over several years, we've developed a handbook for the gardeners, and it just introduces them to the garden and who their steering committee is and what are the acceptable rules for garden maintenance and for your garden plots and the property at large and for garden safety. And it's for everyone, but we expect people to tell us if there's something that they don't like or something that isn't working. And then that becomes important because, again, it has to represent the whole community. I think that's been working.
Allison, I don't want to speak for Laura, but I know they do a lot of wonderful community outreach projects and stuff. So the community is very heavily involved in their garden. I know one of the ways we've been trying to do that is organize events where the community is brought into the garden. We had a plant drop off. We planted a bed for a little girl with cancer who lives in our community. So everyone could see the garden. One of the reasons we thought that was particularly beneficial, we want everyone to see the garden so everyone feels safe. We're in an area that it's a full city block, so there aren't any blind spots. We work hard not to create blind spots, so people do feel safe. And we have made sure that our police know that this is a community garden, that there are going to be people there that some people might judge. I understand. I think I understand what you're asking in your question. So we want the community to know that this is a community garden and there are going to be lots of people on our property. So not to judge. That we have a little free library, we're putting in a prayer labyrinth, we're putting in a playground, we're doing all of these different things to encourage the community to come on the garden. And we're asking our neighbors, we did a survey before we did the garden to see what were the needs in our community. We're also being very careful to ask our neighbors what do they need, not only in terms of food, but issues like safety and security. So we're starting a neighborhood watch and care program where our neighbors not only watch out for each other, but learn each other and get to know each other. It may not solve all of the problems, but it's something we're very sensitive to, and we're asking our neighbors to be sensitive to that as well. We're always looking for feedback, and we would love to have more diversity represented in our leadership. So when people express an interest in the gardens, we try to cultivate diversity so there's a wide range of representation, so no one feels left out, no one feels insecure. We would welcome members of any part of our community, especially those that are not traditionally represented. You mentioned that this panel is white. That may not be represented, that may feel there are barriers to representation. We want them to cross those barriers with us and invite that. If you have suggestions, please hang out afterwards, get my email address or something, and let's continue the conversation.
Absolutely. I'll say too, this is something that I saw very much play out with food is free beds, that folks were really hesitant to harvest from those beds because you kind of feel like you're stealing. This food is here to be harvested by anyone, but certainly also the appearance of, is someone driving by going to think that I am stealing from this garden bed? And we all know that there are people in every community that are going to try to self-police, sometimes to confront people or to call in police into a situation that need not be tense. So sometimes that can be an uncomfortable place for people to be taking even from what's freely given. And I find that one of the avenues that we have to address that sometimes seems like it could not possibly be enough, but is nevertheless important, is good signage. Just to make sure that it's clearly labeled, this is a community garden, this food is here for people to take, not only to make people comfortable accessing that resource, but also to make sure that there's no ambiguity from the community about if someone is accessing that resource, that's something to be celebrated and not something to be curtailed. So I know we're starting to run a little close on time, so I'm going to combine some of our next sections and just have an invitation for everybody to talk about threats and opportunities. Feel free to bounce around with some threats that you've seen to the success of the community gardens. Some that I could suggest as categories would be underutilization, volunteer fatigue, facilitating against multiple seasons. I know it can be tricky if we've got too many cooks in the kitchen to plan a healthy rotation for our soil, for example. The possibilities of community friction, if we've got a neighbor that doesn't like people coming into the garden and sometimes talking at early on a Saturday morning or something like that. But I also want to talk about opportunities to build community bonds we've kind of touched on, educational opportunities and the way that tasting new foods is good for our health. So panelists, feel free to jump in anywhere you'd like to start and share your wisdom.
I'm going to jump in. In the past, many of the community gardens, Boris and Stafford, I had personally had serious fatigue issues because there weren't enough people participating, and I was having to do more than my share. Happily, in the current garden, the Sears community garden, there's a small but dedicated group of people that are working together, and it makes all the difference. Particularly, currently, sure, but also, I didn't say this, I mentioned the renovation. I had an unbelievable army of people come to help make the renovation happen. And if they hadn't come, the renovation, I don't want to say it wouldn't have happened, but it wouldn't have happened as easily. So I'm loving this particular garden that I'm working at very much over previous gardens that I've worked at.
Thank you.
In regards to threats, one thing that we've mentioned a few times already, which is underutilization. I think that really connects to a lot of the other questions and issues that have been brought up. So when it comes to being in a community, it's so important that you do research about that place, not just research about the soil that you're going to be using, but about the history of the site and the neighborhood that you're in, and making sure that you're connecting to the leaders in that neighborhood. If you've done those things, you'll find out what the needs are in that community, and then perhaps you can provide support for what's already happening there. I think sometimes it's great to just connect with other folks that are already working in certain areas. So we've heard from pretty much everyone, in order for these community gardens to be really successful, you need a strong core group of people that are committed to the project. And that also connects to facilitating across seasons. Interesting challenge is that often in the summer, like that's when you see the most need for work in the garden, and sometimes that's when it can be hard to get people out to the garden. There's a lot in the spring. There's often a lot of energy for, as Grayson mentioned earlier, for planting, and then in the summer for maintaining the garden and harvesting. Sometimes that's when we find that the numbers dip down. So just making sure before you get started that you have that strong core of support and coming from within the community that you're working in.
Thanks, Laura. I'll echo. I've seen many times everyone wants to grow tomatoes because there's nothing as good as that fresh, homegrown summer tomatoes. But sometimes if everyone in their individual plots grows tomatoes, in the third year, our soil is depleted, our tomatoes are inundated with pests, and gardeners become frustrated saying, I don't know if I want to keep growing here because my garden was not very successful. So a great leader with communication and who can also take advantage of that opportunity to teach, to say, let's, maybe try to switch out your harvest, put in some compost, to be able to offer some of those solutions. It can be key for keeping people engaged. Other thoughts?
I know one of our best resources, we have tried to connect in with people who have done this before. One of our first connections was Allegheny Mountain Institute. We've connected with Project Grows. Some of our, I haven't with you, Laura, but some of our other people have made the connections with you. Another excellent resource is your Virginia Cooperative Extension agents. They can help provide education in your garden through their Master Gardeners program. And they are working with us to do culinary education as well. So once not only education on what you grow, but after you harvest, what you do with the harvest. So if you're doing a larger community garden, even a small one, I recommend you reach out to them as well. They're excellent community resource for this kind of stuff too.
I would echo that.
I'd like to mention a resource also. The American Community Gardening Association is a really wonderful organization. I really recommend that anyone who has a community garden get listed with them. They taught me so much in the beginning because, when you start something like this, you know, how much experience, I had no experience except for being part of another community garden. I had never started one before. And they just had so much information, and their annual gatherings are amazing. You will meet people from all over the country in every kind of community garden. So that was really awesome. And I just wanted to speak quickly to the underutilization problem, because I think that's one that every single community type and school garden runs into. So what we did was if we had extra beds, we would offer them to churches or groups that were either already growing for the food pantry or might be interested. We offered some of the current gardeners extra beds if they needed them. We used some for teaching beds, which I think is the best way to teach gardening, is right in the garden. And that was great because they became demonstration gardens. And, to speak to that tomato issue, you don't really want a monoculture of tomatoes in your whole community garden to begin with. So if you have some teaching beds or demonstration beds where you can show how you can grow the tomatoes, but tucked in around the tomatoes, and underneath you can have your lettuces and your parsleys and your basil, and you can have all kinds of things. You can grow really intensive gardening in a small space. So that's been one of the things that's been really helpful for us. And then also the buddy system. If you're going to be away in the summer for a couple of weeks, engage another gardener to take care of your garden. Or we had another thing where you could plant a little flag in your garden that said, for the food pantry garden, pick me. So while those people were away or they couldn't be in their garden, someone was still harvesting and watching over their garden. And I think all of those different ways of addressing that problem have actually, been pretty successful.
That's awesome. I can't believe I never thought of something similar. It's such a simple fix, but so important. At this point, we are over our 10:30 mark, so I would like to turn off our recording and open this up to a discussion with anyone who's got something to add from our audience. I know that some folks have had to jump away to other commitments, but I would love to, if we can carve out a few minutes for folks to share. If you are a representative in the audience of a community garden who needs some volunteers, if you're looking for space, now is a great time for something like that. So I'm going to stop recording. And